the Sri Lankans and Nepalese had a huge set of political problems with India. Nepal says, look, why should I give it to India? India is hegemonic, or some. Sri Lanka will say, look, India has messed around with their internal politics. So I think the natural logic of transborder connectivity and economic projects became victims of politics.
Hi, so in this week's Rajamandala, I've looked at geo-economics and a sort of economic integration of sorts within South Asia, within the Indian subcontinent. And it's an interesting prospect, especially given the recent visits by the Prime Minister and President of Nepal and Sri Lanka. Respectively, there's been a lot of interest in the region from Japan, France, other middle and major global powers. One of the things you look at in the article, which was interesting, is how much was this either delayed or stalled because of SAARC not functioning, or maybe some of the countries having put too many eggs in the SAARC basket?
I think the SAARC never really took off. So in a way, we shouldn't be right to blame SAARC. Because SAARC, assuming it had functioned well, even then, part of the problem was not just in Pakistan didn't want to do things with India, but for India itself. I think India took time to integrate the region into its general economic strategy. Because once, post-independence, because India was the largest economy, I think that's one of the main arguments, that in India that's open, opens its markets for its neighbors, can integrate unilaterally because just the size and the location. Because except Pakistan and Afghanistan, none of the other South Asian countries have borders with each other. So in a way, what India does is the key. And I think here is what happened. I think between 1950 to 1990, the economic strategy did not value trade. If you're building socialism in one country, autarky, you're not really interested in, opening your borders for the others. And everybody else followed the same formula, whether it's Bhutto in Pakistan or, Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh or the Bandar Naik case in Sri Lanka. Everybody in South Asia was a socialist. So they didn't really think trade and connectivity was such a great idea. We all met in New York. We all met in non-aligned summits. But within the region, there was, in fact, there was a rollback from the kind of integration that existed under the British Raj. After all, India was one. The markets were one. Then, of course, the political partition need not have been followed by economic partition. But the economic partition took place by de facto the policies that we pursued. So it's only after 1990, when the old economic model collapses, India turns to a new strategy of liberalization at home and globalization. So it's only in the 90s that the region begins to talk about trade, preferential trade agreements, free trade agreements, connectivity projects. This agenda is not on the table through the 90s. In fact, SAARC itself was set up only in 1985, more like, okay, others are doing it, so let's do it. So it's only when India's economic strategy changed that the region becomes important for the larger question of how does India gain strength in the world. But the early years, the reform was tentative, so you couldn't really push big ideas. And when we had big ideas, for example, when we want to do a project in Nepal or say Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankans and Nepalese had a huge set of political problems with India. Nepal says, look, why should I give it to India? India is hegemonic, or some. Sri Lanka will say, look, India has messed around with their internal politics. So I think the natural logic of transborder connectivity and economic projects became victims of politics of nationalism in the neighborhood. So we were late to coming to it. They were already, have problems with us. So they didn't want to do it with us. So the net gainer of all this was actually China. China had reformed earlier. They'd become a major economy. By turn of the millennium, they were already getting a force. So China steps into South Asia and China becomes the largest trading partner for all countries, including India, starts doing big projects. Suddenly, India finds that actually, while India is not integrating the region, China was trying to integrate it through China-Pakistan economic corridor, through China-Nepal corridor and China-Myanmar corridor. So by the time India woke up, you already had a large economy and a major power actually setting its own agenda. It's only in the last few years, I would say, that India is finally saying, look, how do I deal with it? And that's why today finally we're saying we're investing more money, trying to fix problems with the neighbors. And that's what we saw in Bangladesh for the last 5-6 years. Thanks to the support we had from Sheikh Hasina, we've done a lot of projects. We opened up the borders. We're building pipelines across. Bangladesh has opened up for more railway routes. It is giving its ports for Indian businesses to operate. There is transit trade. So things which sounded impossible in the 90s and even early 2000s have become, once Delhi and Dhaka started cooperating. I think that template I see now being replicated between Delhi and Kathmandu, Delhi and Colombo.
One of the interesting things, like India had the 9 balance payments crisis, which sort of pushed liberalization onto us. You see similar things happening, in fact, perhaps worse, in both Pakistan and Sri Lanka. There, whether it's IMF loans, whether it's to attract investment, everyone actually should read the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com. And probably wherever you're watching this video, in the description there should be a link. So, but is there a danger that this is, like we've seen it with Pakistan? I mean, the record, I think there's the most number of times any country has gone to the IMF. Sri Lanka, it's something like this hasn't happened, at least in recent memory. But is there a fear that this could just be a moment rather than a more permanent change? Can those economies afford to do that? I mean, once it gets resolved, you go back to your old ways, or that this opportunity could be lost?
There's always that danger. Look, politicians will reform only when it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, moment things improve, they can easily roll back. And I think we in India don't realize how deeply statist and socialist Sri Lanka had become. That it had really not done, even the kind of reforms that India has done after 1990. So I think now the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has actually talked about those reforms. He's committed to doing it in IMF. So we don't know how much he'll implement, but he's also more open to India, working with India. So that's the good news from Sri Lanka, that they're more open to doing things with India. Earlier, they were not. And when the Sri Lankan president came here, we agreed on a big agenda. Because the next few weeks and months, we'll see how it is going to be implemented. But with Pakistan, of course, we don't have a direct... Pakistan is not ready to integrate with India, but they're opening up to Gulf, which is a new thing. That, after all, they always had good relations with Gulf countries. But on the economic side, they were more focused on China, integrating with China rather than with the Gulf. But today, we see them actually signing on to the next few days. I think we're going to see interesting action in Pakistan, where they might open up their economy for the Gulf investments. But there will also be problems, like in India. The reforms are not easy.
Yeah.
Simply prospect, it is easy to say you have to do reform. I mean, you remember how difficult it was to get anything through the parliament, coalition governments. Same BJP in power would say, I support this reform, but when in opposition, they would oppose the reform. The Congress would do the same. So getting anything through the political process, through the bureaucracy, was very, very hard. So it involves not just a political decision, but the capability, bureaucratic, political capability to navigate the minefields that a reform process opens up. So India did all that. Now, the question is whether Sri Lanka and Pakistan, can they do it? We don't know. But there is pressure because they're broke.
Yeah.
So there is a lot more pressure on them than there was on us. So that's what we have to see, whether it's actually be able to do it.
The final question, you touch on it in the piece as well. There is also a great power context to this, in the sense that because there's a US-China rivalry as well as an India-China rivalry, or at least India is in quite a bit of danger, both economically as well as on our borders from China. Is that the kind of collaborations we're now having with the US in other countries, or with Japan, or with France? Is it now, do we have viable alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative? Whether it's like Pakistan, of course, CPEC, they've really put quite a few eggs in that basket. But in places like Sri Lanka and Nepal, which had seen major Chinese investment, sometimes one could argue at the expense of India. Do you see that shifting now because of so much more interest in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, at least we're talking about South Asia. We're not talking about across the world. scale of the Chinese resources, nobody else can match at this point. And it's a government project, it's a strategic project. But as we saw in the case of Belt and Road, I mean, there are problems as well. I mean, it has run into problems in many countries. And within Sri Lanka and Pakistan, both places, at least one view is that it was the BRI that generated these problems by being both Pakistani elite and the Sri Lankan elite not doing the due diligence, just accepting Chinese terms. See, to be able to offer an alternative, you don't have to do too much. I mean, if you say, for example, what is the interest rate on which you're giving the loan? The Chinese have been really pretty hard on the neighbors. In fact, you've seen how difficult they were in agreeing to restructure Sri Lanka's debt. So I think in India and its partners, for example, can produce packages where they say, look, like, which is what India has done, demonstrated to Sri Lankans in the last 2 years of the crisis, being the most helpful country, helping them internationally, as well as offering a package where it stands more beneficial for the Sri Lankan people than the Chinese projects. So this will take some time to demonstrate, but I think the first steps have been taken. So I don't think it is impossible, because in the end, it's not just about money, because the world has money, banks have money. Now we are talking about multilateral development banks being reformed. It is a question of having good projects and the terms being acceptable. I think it was easy for the elites in Pakistan and Sri Lanka to simply sell the Chinese projects as collective good, while there were a lot of people made a lot of money, but the countries are paying the price. So I think a more transparent governance, more due diligence on the part of the two countries would provide a different basis for assessing projects, and I think that itself would be a step forward.
Great, sir. Thank you so much, everyone. Read the piece. It's on theindianexpress.com, and we'll see you next week. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Akash.